Question number 8, Dr Kennedy Graham.
Thank you, sir. To the Prime Minister. Does he stand by his statement that, quote, should New Zealand military personnel be deployed in Iraq, they would be behind the wire and limited to training local forces in order to counter ISIL and legitimately protect innocent people? If so, why?
Honourable Jerry Barney on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, yes, because that is the government's position.
Supplementary question, Dr Kennedy Graham.
Will he rule out any possibility that military training by New Zealand forces in Iraq will escalate into active combat there?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, consideration is clearly being done at the moment of what that sort of capacity building deployment may look like. We will need to get all of that information, consider how it comes together as a mission, and then make decisions about whether or not we are there.
Point of order.
Point of order, Dr Kennedy Graham.
My question did not pertain to the considerations relating to a decision to deploy training now, but to the consequences.
Order. I'm going to invite the member to ask that question again.
Thank you, sir. Will he rule out any possibility that military training by New Zealand forces in Iraq, in the event it occurs, will escalate into active combat there?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, given that the government has not made its decision yet about what type, if at all, of capacity building we may engage in, the question put by the member is entirely hypothetical.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr Kennedy Graham.
In light of the likely deployment of military trainers, on what evidence did the Prime Minister base his claim that the risk of ISIL becoming stronger is greater than the increased risk New Zealand will face by becoming part of the coalition in that event?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I would have thought it would have been evident, even to the peaceable Green Party, that if the world is going to be confronted by a terrorist state that respects no boundaries, that respects no other position than their own, then that is a threat to every country that values freedom.
Supplementary question, Dr Kennedy Graham.
Thank you, sir. In light of the illegal and disastrous invasion of Iraq in 2003, which was basically supported by this national government at the time, does he consider there is a political case for avoiding military action against ISIL now?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, I note that it was the Green Party propping up the Labour Party in 2003 that saw New Zealand's involvement ratified by government at that time.
Order.
Point of order.
Order. Order. Order. I have a point of order, Dr Kennedy Graham.
Sir, I understand the difference between points of order and debating points, but that reply is, I think, stretching standing orders.
Order. Order. No, I can assist the member. In actual fact, the question asked and the connotation of the question asked in itself stretched standing orders. Does the member have a further supplementary? Further supplementary, Dr Kennedy Graham.
Given the Prime Minister's statement yesterday that New Zealand supports coalition airstrikes because, quote, we believe that's a legitimate way of seeing a containment and hopefully long-term destruction of the threat from ISIL, end quote, will he ask the Attorney-General to table a written opinion affirming that there is a sound basis in international law for that action?
Honourable Jerry Brownlee on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, firstly, I think it's disappointing that having gone out yesterday and laid out very clearly the sort of threat that New Zealand could face, that we get questions in the House today attempting to deny that circumstance. Mr Speaker, this is an organisation, a terrorist organisation. I'm answering his question, but he's clearly upset by the answer.
The member has a right to raise a point of order, but I'll be disappointed if it's another attempt by the member to say he's not happy with the answer. Dr Kennedy-Graham.
Sir, my question did not pertain to the degree of threat. It pertained to whether a response to it was consistent with international law. He is misdescribing my question.
Well, the question wasn't as clear as that at all. There was a lead into the question. Order. The question then asked whether the Prime Minister will be asking the Attorney-General to table a legal opinion from memory. The question wasn't a clear question in my mind. It may have been in the member's mind. The Minister is attempting to address it, and I'd be grateful if the House would allow the Minister to complete his answer.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, post the clarification by way of point of order. Mr Speaker, can I suggest that the member looks at UN Article 51 to come to his own understanding that the airstrikes are in fact legal.
Supplementary question, Dr Kennedy.
Point of order.
Point of order, Dr Kennedy-Graham.
I just seek leave to table the Security Council document recording the statement of one of the permanent members that Resolution 2170 cannot be seen as approval of the use of military action.
Order. Leave us sought to table a United Nations document. I think it's clause 2970. Leave us sought to table that document. Is there any objection to it being tabled? There is not. It can be tabled. Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Given the Minister's comments on the question of risks to New Zealand, how many of the 30 to 40 people of concern in the foreign fighter context that the Prime Minister referred to in his ministerial statement yesterday fit a certain profile, and what are the main features of that profile?
Honourable
Mr Speaker,
Jerry Brownlee, on behalf of the Prime Minister.
On behalf of the Prime Minister, I'm not giving that information this afternoon.
Question number 9, Sua Williams-Theo.
Mr Speaker, my